I took the opportunity really to think a little bit out of the box when I was asked, because it was a vision I understood at all. I don't get into sparring with political adversaries so much as to really say, if we all closed our eyes and thought, what kind of an Ireland do you want to live in? What society would you like to have ahead? What would we like for our children, our grandchildren? What's wrong with the country we're in at the moment, and why do we have these recurring problems of unemployment, immigration? We went through great times. I retired from the union as president in 2003. We had full employment. We had the biggest growth rate in Europe. We had virtually no forced immigration. It was all, it was voluntary immigration. And you could have looked at all the statistics and say Ireland was really that success story. And how quickly it all went to dust. And I think it's important, therefore, to look and take a long view, a medium view, maybe, and a short-term view. And in terms of vision, I think Fintan Lalor as a visionary, because in a time of extraordinary poverty, turbulence, conflict, he was able to think beyond his own contemporaries and look into the future and look at the kind of world he wanted to live in. He stood up to his own father, who was a repealer, landlord but a repealer, supported Daniel O'Connell. He challenged Daniel O'Connell. He challenged the Young Irelanders. He challenged, indeed, a lot of his contemporary political friends. He was at one time, he was a very complex figure. He wasn't a simple nationalist. At one stage, in fact, he opposed repeal and suggested land reform was more important than repeal. So when you study Fintan Lalor's life, it's very, very complex, but all the time probing to try and find truth, future, and what would be a best society. So for me, and by the way, I think it's summed up very well in his letters, where he actually says what he wanted was a fair share of Ireland, a fair share of the earth, a house to live in, how fundamental that is at the moment, and that no one can tumble that house down, a happy home, the necessities of life, the comforts and decencies of life, all those things without which the world is worthless and existence becomes a misery. These are the securities that we all should have. So, it's a very fundamental view in the kind of times that he lived, very important. But for me, the important issue about Fintan Lalor was that he saw Ireland as a social question, not just a political question of whether the British left, or even a question to do with landlords. It was about the whole state of the social order, how people lived, how labourers lived. He had alliances, incidentally, with labour unions and labour groups in Dublin. He supported the progressive elements in the repeal movement and indeed in the Young Irelanders. But he put that social question at the centre, and that's the reason why James Connolly, Jim Larkin, Padraig Pearson, the Sovereign People, and indeed a lot of people who came after Fintan Lalor attributed so much to Fintan Lalor for his contribution to the thought process that led to our independence. And I believe his thinking had an influence on the Dáil, the first Dáil, on the 1916 proclamation, and on the subsequent objectives that many people set out in this country. Now, I have a fundamental problem with some visionaries, by the way, because the world is full of conflict at the moment, where you have people in some parts of the world think they have a Shiite country, a Muslim country, a Hindu country, Catholic republic, a Protestant Northern Ireland, and people have these visions which become nightmares for other people. Hitler had a vision, Stalin had a vision, and very often these visions lead to absolute nightmare. So the only protection we have against these visionaries is our own intelligence, and developing the thought process of people, the questioning, the understanding of change, and learning and educating ourselves to be able to deal with these ideas. I believe that while there's a lot of debate going on the Dáil about a bank inquiry, and I remember the Labour Party, but I'm not defending the Labour Party here, I don't think it's so much to what one individual did or said in that bank inquiry that will come out. I think really the question has to be, who allowed a fundamental economic process to develop, which was dictated by Margaret Thatcher, the ideas of Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, which actually took power away from elected representatives, politicians, and the democratic process, and gave it to the markets. Who are the markets? Markets are people with money, and that money generally came from other people. And as we discovered in this country, there were people generating money for themselves that they didn't own, they never owned, and when they got into trouble, they didn't pay it. We have to pay for it. And one of the aspects of this society that we have created is that we socialised all the risk and we privatised all the profit, so that you could actually make money and you were a millionaire and you're a great fella. You could buy politicians, you could buy houses, property. But when things went wrong, the ordinary citizens had to pick up the pieces. And what's going on at the moment is that we, as citizens, ordinary taxpayers, are carrying the burden of a misappropriation of resources right across not only Ireland, but across Europe and indeed globally. In fact, if you look back from the Great Recession in the 1929s, they brought in legislation in America, the Glass-Steagall Act, where they set about reforming the international financial system, controlling banks, incidentally, in the early 30s, so that, in fact, the local banks would be under local control, but in the global situation, there would actually be far more regulation and banking regulation. And unfortunately, that was stripped apart. And there's a very, very strong tendency in recent times, which I think is an absolute disaster for social, if we're thinking about a social Europe or a society, that neoliberalism, which is the new brand of that financial order, has now come into vogue, which actually believes that markets will solve all these problems. But I never tell you that from 1929 up to the present time, there have been 90 individual cases of market failure, causing huge consequences all over the world, Southeast Asia, different places. There is no perfect market solution, and there is not going to be a perfect market solution. So unless we begin to think beyond that and think of how and what sort of society are we going to develop. Now, I had decided when I came here not to concentrate so much on the economic, because Brian Lenihan, who didn't share my political views, but persuaded me to go on the board of the central bank. And I refused it 3 times, I must tell you, because I'm not a banker. I never had to do banking all my life. And he said, that's the reason I want you to go on this bank. He said, I've been given all these names by the civil sector. They're all bankers and accountants. And I want someone who's not a banker or an accountant on the board of the central. So I'm on the central bank board, so I might as well declare that I'm prejudiced here when I'm here. And I've learned an awful lot in there. And what I have learned is that we don't control our destiny, and that we're grappling with, and all the politicians, and I actually have sympathy for every politician, because they have not got the solutions, and they're not easy, and there is no simple solution. And they have to keep coming back to the people and admitting that we don't actually control our own financial future. We're now in the hands of the Troika, but even if we're out from the Troika, you still have to satisfy the markets. You still have to do all sorts of things about how you spend your money, how you run your economy, so that you're attractive for investors. Now, I'm very familiar with that and dealt with it all my life as a trade unionist. So, how do we move forward from here? I think that what we have to do is to start thinking afresh at the kind of society that we want to build. And I think that that has to be built on something other than markets, and something maybe other than economics as we understand it. Now, over my lifetime, I became very, very sceptical about what I would call classical economics. And I'll just give an example of what I mean, just to give you a simple equation maybe to make sense of what I'm talking about. If you applied classical economics to nuclear power, you would come to the conclusion it's the cheapest, most efficient and most effective form of power that you could have. All the sums, all the bottom lines, very cheap, very clean, very effective, very, very good. But if you add in the social consequences of one error, or the environmental destruction, or what the people of Japan have faced and the people of 5 Mile Island, or what they faced in Middle Europe, then the whole calculation goes out the wall. But we run a society on the first form of calculation, the bottom line, pounds, shillings and pence, what's profitable, what's not profitable, and the social dimension, the environmental consequences and societal impact doesn't even fit in there. And the role of the politician is to try and keep getting these back in somewhere, because they're under pressure from the people who elect them to try and do that. And it's almost an impossible task, because the fundamentals are at fault. Now, I'm going beyond the box here, because I think you have to do that if you're talking about a vision. My vision is that we've got to actually encourage our next generation and this generation to start thinking outside of that limited sphere of thinking. And I have to say, Michael D. Higgins, our president, has been doing most in recent times to keep saying that to people. Don't be intimidated by the experts. Don't be intimidated by the way things are. And let's think, and think openly, and think of a society that doesn't marginalise people, that doesn't put people with unusual ideas outside of the box. Get them in there, get them talking, let's develop. And Jim Larkin had a very interesting concept that I always liked from him. He had many, many errors, but made many errors. And he wasn't the man we want at the moment, in my opinion. But I'll say this about him. He believed in the strength of an intelligent movement. In other words, get people have knowledge, get them have understanding, and apply their own intelligence to the problems of the society. And that's the way that you move forward. I think that we can solve these problems. I think we have to have a new form of economics. I don't want to spend too long on that. Economics, for me, has to be not unidimensional. It has to be social, environmental and financial. And indeed, it has to bring in more democracy. not less democracy, and we've got to be able to challenge markets and regulate them properly. It was the lack of regulation. It was the buy-in of the political system that we didn't have to regulate banks, that we can't regulate the international markets. You're going to have to think globally. The international community is now recognising the disaster. In the United States, they're thinking anew about their own concept of economics. They're thinking anew in the IMF. I see a complete change in 2 years in the thinking of the International Monetary Fund. They put now employment centrally, which they didn't for a long time. That's a social issue. It's not just to do with the bottom line. And I see even the banking system internationally talking about BAL 2 and BAL 3. They're talking about international regulation of banks and financial institutions. In other words, they've got to depart from the idea, or the simplistic idea of Margaret Thatcher, that there was no society. And she did actually argue there was no such thing as society. It was just individuals and individualism. Now, our tradition was communitarian. Our tradition was collective. Our tradition for the Ireland that we created was the people trying to get together, the Fintan Lalors. I'm sure the IFA wouldn't welcome talking about nationalising the land. I don't know if it would be of any contribution to us at the moment. But the idea on the table should be that there's responsibility for those who own land, who own factories, who own enterprise, who own resources, to share those resources better, redistribute. And I'll just finish on this point. Everyone talks about we need growth to get out of the problem. What about a bit more redistribution within the society? There's still a lot of money, still a lot of people made a lot of money, there are a lot of resources. I believe we could get employment and growth out of a more intelligent approach to redistribution, proper intelligent regulation. I don't mean over-regulation, overburdening regulation. Help people. And I am delighted with this year for one simple reason. I've been all over the country for various reasons. I think the gathering was a spark of genius. Because what it actually did, in the middle of this dilemma, instead of expecting someone on high to solve the problem, virtually every community in Ireland grasped the idea that they could do something for themselves, and that their relatives abroad could make a contribution, and that in a society you could actually begin to do things to change the world you live in. And you people in Laois today, in my opinion, are doing the same thing. You come into Dunamase, you apply your mind, you'll have debate, discussion, we may disagree, we may fall out. But is that letting the genie out of the bottle? It is that promotion of thinking and encouraging our kids to be part of that discussion that we'll get out of this problem. There are no geniuses have all the solutions on there, and no matter what colour they are and what they claim to be, they can only do it with the help of the people, and you've got to persuade people, you've got to encourage people, and you've got to get that constructive rebuilding concept of Ireland, because we do need to rebuild this community. And I believe the social question has to be put back in the centre. Employment, how we live, the society we live in, how we relate to each other, what's fairness, what's inclusion. And don't let the bottom line characters who got away with printing our money to make themselves wealthy, and when they lost, they come back looking for us to pay for their bills. So, good a minute.